Afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about the RDCTN's Rare Disease Clinical Trial Identification Project. To outline, I'll briefly go through why the project was done, how we did it, and what we found. The project was designed to compile a body of data that could provide us with a reference list of the rare disease trials in the EU and Ireland, their orphanet codes, and researcher details. This data could then serve as a valuable information resource, provide a benchmark on Ireland's rare disease clinical trial activity, and highlight gaps in rare disease clinical trial reporting. So where and how did we look for this data? So we downloaded clinical trial data from 4 registries. We did this using search criteria for ongoing interventional phase 2 or 3 clinical trials happening in the EU. No start date was used to filter these trials, so all trials existing on these registries up until the end of 2024 were used. We only retained non-cancer rare disease trials, as we know that cancer as a disease process has the highest trial activity, including here in Ireland. And so for some context, Orphanet aims to improve the visibility of rare diseases in health research information systems. So each disease recorded on Orphanet is given a unique and stable identifier known as an ORPHA code. So to make sure that the conditions studied in our identified trials were classified as rare, we cross-referenced these to Orphanet and recorded their ORPHA codes. Using this data, we found that around 50% of all trials happening in the EU were rare disease clinical trials. In Ireland, we found 104 rare disease clinical trials, which is about 66% of all the trials happening in Ireland. These 104 rare disease trials make up only 6% of the rare disease trials happening in the EU. So overall, we see a relatively high percentage of all trials in Ireland that are rare disease trials, but a low percentage of all EU rare disease trials having a site in Ireland. In Ireland's 104 rare disease clinical trials, we saw that 67 different rare disease conditions were studied. And using this information, we were able to find the top 10 rare disease conditions studied in the EU and in Ireland. And I've highlighted some of the differences here. Ireland's top study conditions, hemophilia A, pulmonary arterial hypertension, and cystic fibrosis were consistent with what was seen in the EU. This data also provided information on the types of sponsors in Ireland's rare disease clinical trials. It is important to note that some of the registries recorded this differently from each other, so we have assigned catch-all terms to categorize this information. And we see here that industry-led rare disease clinical trials are by far the most common in Ireland up until the end of 2024. We then compared the rare disease clinical trial activity to that of Denmark and Finland due to their relatively similar population sizes and gross national income per capita, as recorded in 2023, which is similar to IFA's report that we heard earlier. In all 3, over 50% of their clinical trials were studying a rare condition. The highest proportion of trials, which were rare disease trials, was seen in Ireland when compared to Denmark and Finland. However, Denmark had almost 3 times as many rare disease trials compared to Ireland, and this means that Denmark was a site for about 17% of all rare disease clinical trials happening in the EU, with Ireland behind them at 6%. There were 3 main challenges in capturing the rare disease clinical trial activity in Ireland. The first was using registry date filters to understand how many trials matched our criteria between 2020 and 2024. This date filter actually meant that all trials passing our criteria on the day of the search were only included if they also had a start date after 2020. This meant that rare disease trials that should have been included in our data because they were ongoing in 2024 were excluded because their date might have been before 2020. So therefore, we couldn't use registry date filters to assess trial activity during a specific period. Registry data also doesn't include ORPHA codes, so cross-referencing disease conditions to Orphanet to identify rare conditions was labor-intensive and leaves room for a lot of human error. This calls for the need to require ORPHA codes inclusion in registry data to make identifying rare disease clinical trials more accessible. And lastly, the numbers presented here today probably have already changed. New trials added to the registry since our 2024 search would not be included here. And this highlights the need to automate this type of data collection and analysis of rare disease clinical trials. So all in all, the take-home message from today's overview is that the RDCTN now has a reference list of Ireland's 104 rare disease clinical trials, which is incredibly valuable for trial information and accessibility. This analysis identified that a high percent of all trials in Ireland are studying a rare condition. However, that many other rare disease trials happening in the EU do not have an Irish site. To enhance our ability to assess rare disease clinical trial activity going forward, registry dates filters need to be refined, and author codes for rare disease conditions should be mandatory, and this process of identifying rare disease clinical trials should be automated. And by addressing these inefficiencies in rare disease clinical trial reporting, we can improve on that accessibility and benchmarking for Ireland. So to end, I'd just briefly like to thank our partners and all the organizations that make it possible to access data for a project like this. If anybody has any questions, they can contact me directly. I've put my email on the screen. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer any now, if you would like.